Hey guys, Brett Weiss here. Welcome to another video. What is one thing that no gamer, no game collector did during the 1990s? One thing that I've never heard any gamer from the 1990s say they did. What is that thing? Stay tuned and you'll find out. Yes, during the 1990s, I was a major game collector. I was collecting stuff like crazy to play, to resell, to collect, to put on my shelf, mostly to play, mostly to fill out the collection. But you know what I was not doing? And you know what nobody I know was doing at the time? Buying multiple copies of games to resell at a later date. Now, I'm not talking about resellers of the time who might have a booth at a flea market and find some games marked down at Toys R Us for $1 or $2 or $3 and putting them in his flea market booth or her flea market booth for $3 or $4 or $5, $6. I'm not talking about resellers of the time that might buy multiple copies of something that was drastically reduced. I'm talking about none of us, not one of us, at least that I know of, was buying multiple copies of video games to resell at a much later date, sort of as an investment. And guys, during the 1990s, it was an incredible time to be a collector. Whether you're talking garage sales, flea markets, thrift stores, pawn shops, or new games marked down at the store. Like today, you can find new games marked down at the stores. I see people posting these incredible finds at Walmart of games for modern consoles being marked down to just a few dollars each. A lot of that happened in the 90s as well. It's just funny to look back on because sealed games that are now really valuable for the Super Nintendo, for the NES, for the Genesis, thinking about buying those for, $1, $2, or $3 each at, Toys R Us, KB Toys, those kind of places now, Walmart, Target. It's really interesting to think about. But at the time, during the 1990s, and this applies to the 80s as well, no one had any inkling, nobody had any inkling that video games were going to be worth a lot of money someday, especially key titles, rare titles, popular titles, factory sealed titles, games that people still want to play, that they still want to collect. They never thought in a million years that 20, 30 years down the road, these games would be worth a lot of money like a lot of them are today. I have never talked to a single collector. I'm talking about OG collectors. I'm talking about guys like the Immortal John Hancock, who has all these complete sets. I'm talking about guys like Joe Santulli and John Hardy, who founded the National Videogame Museum in Texas. I've talked to these guys. They weren't buying multiple copies and putting them away for investments. You know what people were buying in the 90s, specifically the early 1990s, to put away as investments, multiple copies? Sports cards and comic books. It was an amazing craze for gimmicky comic books in the early 1990s, all these variant covers, these lenticular covers, multiple covers, all kinds of crazy stuff in the early 90s. There was a big collector boom for comics, #1 issues, hologram covers, all these things. People were buying multiple copies, putting them away. There was a Wizard top 10 list that people were investing in. Remember Valiant comics? #1 issues got to be, over $100 each in some cases, maybe more. Sports cards, comic books, overproduced. I remember in 1989, NBA Hoops cards came out. People were buying them up like crazy. That was the first basketball card in a few years that was by anybody other than Fleer. And NFL Pro Set, 89, 90, these cards were just overproduced. And that's fine. People were buying these cards for fun in a lot of cases, but a lot of these cards were being bought up as investments. Upper Deck, trading cards, Score, Fleer. There was a major comic book and sports card boom in the early 90s. And that's when I had my comic book store with my brother-in-law. We had a couple of stores, and we sold trading cards in addition to comic books. And we sort of rode the crest of the wave of the speculator boom into our own retail establishment. So it was a great time to be a retailer in some ways, and it was kind of a frustrating time in others because of all these, sort of manufactured gimmicky items. It was kind of hard to tell how many to order sometimes. I know a lot of people over-ordered Turok #1. That was a infamous first issue that was overproduced and that became worthless right away. So many retailers were stuck with that. The death of Superman was a big deal, and then the return of Superman. A lot of those were overbought, overproduced, or whatever. Um, just an amazing time in so many ways to be into comics and cards. It was kind of a dark era in some ways because with comic books, a lot of comics were being published sort of style over substance, like with a lot of the Marvel stuff and with the Image comics, writing sort of took a back seat to rather just stylized artwork, and a lot of people didn't like that. And like I said, with the gimmicky covers and with sports cards being overproduced, it was a really interesting time to be a retailer and a collector. A lot of people got stuck with a lot of junk. I've heard dealers refer to the early 90s as the junk era of sports cards because so much of that stuff was overproduced and absolutely worthless now. You can still buy sealed wax boxes of a lot of those early 90s sports cards for $4, $5, $6 a box. And a lot of times, even dealers, at shows and stuff will be selling them for $10 or $12 each, and you can buy them wholesale for maybe $4 or $5 each. Just massively overproduced. But in the case of video games, people weren't buying multiple copies to put away, to sell at a later time, to invest in. And that's one reason why video games are worth more than, typically in general, than comic books and sports cards of the time. Comic books and sports cards of the early 90s, most of them are virtually worthless, whereas a ton of video games from the earlier 90s are worth quite a bit, especially if you can find them sealed. Some people would buy comic books and immediately put them in a bag and board and not even read them. I remember at our comic book store, mine and my brother-in-law's Fantastic Comics and Cards in the Fort Worth area, 2 locations, one near you or not. Anyway, we had a lot of fun running these stores. And one aspect that was a little frustrating, when people would buy comics and put them away and not read them, we would try to encourage people to, give them a chance, read them, they're fun. But some people just wanted to buy the stuff, put it in the bag. Maybe they liked the covers, maybe they were investing. People would buy multiple copies of #1 issues, multiple copies of gimmicky issues. People would buy sets and sealed boxes of trading cards to put away, to invest in, that just weren't doing it with video games. And that would have been the way to go. If anyone had any foresight in the 1990s to buy up, all these video games that were being put on clearance, to keep them in their factory seal and just put them away, they would make a fortune now in today's collector's market with grading and with sealed games being so popular and being worth so much money. So let me know in the comments, do you know anyone who during the 1990s or 1980s was buying up video games as investments to resell later? Believe me, nobody that I know of anyway, and I've talked to a lot of people, nobody was buying video games as investments. No one was putting away multiple copies. Now, I knew people that would buy sealed games that they didn't play. I knew people that would buy stuff just to fill holes in their collection and that they weren't even that interested in playing. They just wanted it. I knew people that were going after full sets in the 90s of different consoles, of older stuff. But I don't know a single person who was investing in video games and putting away sealed copies, multiple sealed copies, because of any kind of investment. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on this subject. Did you know anyone who invested in video games in the 90s or the 80s? I don't know that there's ever been anyone that has done that. Surely somewhere, but nobody that I know of. Some of these big collections that have been found over the last few years of sealed games, there's just one copy of each game, guys. And if there's multiple copies in these collections, inevitably it was a store owner or maybe a store rental owner, maybe a store that bought and sold games or rented games or whatever. They might have multiple copies because that was store stock. I'm talking about individual collectors, individual investors. They weren't buying video games to put away. Otherwise, you would be finding these, in these collections, you would find multiple copies like you did with comics and cards. Just what didn't happen with video games. Nobody knew they were going to be worth money. Older video games back in the day, back in the 80s and 90s, were generally considered pretty worthless. It was the uncool thing. Like even in school, when a new system come out, that was the cool thing to have. The older stuff was just worthless. Retro tech hasn't been considered valuable for all that long, guys, with few exceptions. Now, yeah, and even back in the 90s, there were some older Atari 2600 games that were considered worth quite a bit. People were starting to realize the rarity and things like that with fanzines and the advent of the internet and everything. But again, people were not investing in this stuff. They weren't going to Toys R Us buying factory sealed games to put away once they saw one on clearance. Like I remember, here's just an anecdote real quick, and I'll wrap up pretty soon. I remember seeing the entire Star Wars trilogy for the Super Nintendo, the Super Star Wars trilogy. They had those marked down to $5 each. And I thought, wow. It even occurred to me, maybe these might be worth $10, at some point. Surely I can flip these for $10, just not even as an investment or any kind of speculation thing. These are so cheap. Surely somebody would pay $10 for them, but I didn't feel super confident about that. I didn't feel, this was late 90s when PlayStation and N64 were taking over and the Super Nintendo was becoming an afterthought. And I thought, and there was just, wasn't a real compelling reason for me to buy a bunch of copies. I could have cleaned them out. I could have probably bought about 20 copies of each Super Star Wars game, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi and Star Wars for the Super Nintendo. And now, those would be worth a lot of money factory sealed. But the only thing that crossed my mind was maybe I could sell them to somebody for $10 at a show or something, but it just didn't seem that compelling. Anyway, let me know in the comments if you ever heard anybody back in the 90s that was investing in video games, that was buying multiple sealed copies of new games to put away, to sell at a later date. They thought they would be good investments. I've never heard of such a thing, but I would love to hear from you if you have heard of such a thing, or just tell me your thoughts on, investing in video games in general. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for liking this video. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. It is incredibly helpful. I'm trying to get to 5,000 subscribers. Should do so in the next few months. Thank you guys so much. We will talk to you in another video.